Did you notice a shift in your quality of life going from this, and obviously you were probably very adapted to it. You're essentially lived most of your life there, as you said, but going from this sort of concrete jungle to this incredible beauty with open space and nature. Did you feel like a physiological shift at all?
Yeah, I don't think you cannot feel that. Your nature down regulates your nervous system in a way that few other things do. What complicated it is we made the initial journey a year ago. So we left New York in September of 2020 after living through the early part of 2020 in New York City, which was, like absolutely terrifying place to be. And even though we landed in Boulder and it was much more outdoor living and much more freedom, it was still living it's been an altered reality. So for sure, it's much more spacious and we can there's, outdoor living, whereas like in New York, we weren't going outside really ever. And here everyone just lives outside, but even when we got here, you'd be hiking on trails. And when people would cross each other on the trail, they'd either pull up their neck thing over their face or throw a mask on, even though you're literally, at 7,000 feet in open air crossing each other. So it's definitely better. And your body feels different here. At least mine does. It affects me.
Yeah.
Nature is the place that I've always gone to touch stone. So.
Absolutely. It was a good friend of mine, a mentor of mine recently introduced me to a concept called nature deficit disorder. And I said, you got to be kidding me. That can't be real. Did you just make that up on the spot to prove a point? And he's like, no. This is well documented. And especially with children these days, we often talk about the double-edged sort of sword with technology. The benefits are many, but the repercussions are many as well. And there's a true deficit, and then that has emotional, cognitive impacts. It has creates physiological issues. I mean, I've even seen it go as far as like people complaining about autoimmune diseases that they've picked up in terms of lifestyle, things that they had no idea what caused them. So it is wild, and I have to agree with you. So I lived in New York for two and a half years, as I was saying, and when I left, I moved to San Francisco. Now, San Francisco is just another concrete jungle, but the difference in energy between these two places was so stark that the pace of life, the sort of California mentality compared to the New York City mentality, actually was like a huge sort of quality of life, peace of mind upgrade for me. So I can only imagine being in Boulder, what that would do to a person. And it's just funny because we're all sort of trying to figure out what's the right place for us. Is there such an idea of even having, planting our seeds, having a home base anymore? And I've personally been almost moving away from that idea because things are changing so rapidly. I think that the new generation in particular is really open to this idea of mobility more than ever before. So I don't know. I'm sort of there's a crossroad, I would say, that I'm in. Do you feel something similar, or are you more looking for like, let's commit to this place or decide not to? Like, how do you feel about it?
Yeah, I think there are pluses and minuses for me. Having lived in something like 14 different Airbnbs, Verbos, rental houses in the last, 14 months, actually, I've experienced a lot. And some of it I loved and some of it I have loathed. And as somebody who's a maker, like my fundamental impulse is to make things. I find that routine and ritual is really important to my ability to create at the level that really nourishes me. And so for me, while I certainly have friends that are entirely nomadic, being semi-nomadic for over a year now has definitely disrupted my ability to create. But it's different in that it's like I literally wrote a book while I was in this semi-nomadic season. So for a really large scale project like that, where it takes months and months and months and like really deep, intense work, that can be disruptive for the ability to go to that place where you just want to go deep. But then at the same time, I run a second company where, we produce media and we produce a podcast, and, that's more intermittent, intense creative dives. And able to dip into the creative space to make that happen more readily. But the challenge there is that before we left New York for the last 6 or 7 years of the podcast, we only recorded in person in our own studio in New York City. Yeah. So I could literally like walk in, turn on the lights, like turn on the on button on our stack of, sound equipment. And this was my sacred space, and I would invite people into it. And that all blew up, in the blink of an eye. We had to learn how to produce remotely. So now I've had to learn how to figure out how to effectively set up a new studio space everywhere we go. And because we're maniacal about the quality of what we produce, not just conversationally, but in terms of, broadcast values.
Yes.
We're constantly grappling with that, with everything from room noise to lighting to post-production. We ship microphones around to guests if we feel like we need them to have higher quality microphones, and that, around the world. And so it's been a learning curve. And some of it I loved. Being in a new space with new energy can actually be really inspiring. But logistics wise, it can also scramble my ability to do what I do with ease. So it's been a sort of like a mixed dance.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, this is it's an iterative process, the dance of figuring it out. And you mentioned your book, which I'm extremely excited about. And I told you offline right before we started, like how much we have in common. It's really, really incredible. And I'm sure you hear that very frequently. But I have to say, to the point where I literally even thought about, like, one of the titles that was up for my book was Spark, or The Spark, or Sparked. And actually the title we ended up going with is Unleashed. So it's very, very ironic. And there's so much of your whole value system and everything that you do that I find so fascinating. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot when it comes to you and your work, the question that's kind of been floating around for me is, did you ever do work that didn't make you feel alive, that really was killing you inside, that was sort of the inception for your values? Or where do you think that came from?
Oh yeah. I mean, I've done a lot of work like that. I think we all have, whether it was, as a kid, washing dishes at the local ice cream parlor. It's like whatever, like I spent, after graduating college, a relatively short stint in outside sales where I was selling long distance telephone services to businesses, and literally would take an elevator to the top floor of an industrial park, like an office park, and start knocking on doors. And my required line was, "Hi, I'm Jonathan Fields here from so-and-so company. I'd like to talk to the president about your long distance needs."
I did that too, actually.
Laughed out of and kicked out of many, many offices. And I was abysmal at that job because it just was so not my bent. But I've also been really fortunate in that I had role models in my parents who both spent a lot of time doing things that really lit them up. My dad had a single job his entire career. He was a research professor, ran a lab in human cognition. Literally, even now he's retired, he continues with his research, just not under like the umbrella of the bizarre world of academia. And my mom's been an artist, like her entire life. So it's always been like a little bit of like an artist counterculture exposure. And, while that's not always the easiest life, it certainly gave me the nod. Looking at the choices that both of them made, there were struggles associated with both, but they also both unwittingly let me know that, you can do something which may, be a little bit different, but it's possible to actually step into this thing called work and life and invest your energy in a way that is actually nourishing beyond a paycheck. And of course, a paycheck matters. I'm a grown up with a family and I want to be okay. But there's more. But beyond that, for me, a really pivotal moment. There have been a number of really big pivotal moments. One is, like in a very past life, I was a lawyer and I ended up in emergency surgery when the stress of the job and the relentless hours collapsed my immune system, leading to a giant infection in the middle of my body that ate a hole through my intestines from the outside in. And that sent me into, that wasn't fun. Sent me into emergency surgery. Thankfully, I was okay. But I started making a list of things that I wanted to do with my life if I could figure out how to earn a city worthy living doing them. And that sent me back into the world of entrepreneurship and well-being and fitness, where I built a company and then sold it. Um, and then the next really big moment for me that I think is honestly the catalyst for the work that has been the deeper focus of the last 5 years for me was 9/11. You know, being a longtime New York City person, being in the city when 9/11 happened, knowing somebody who was at the top of one of the towers who didn't come home.
Wow.
And then, you know, like seeing what that did to his family. I had signed a 6-year lease for a floor in a building to create what I hoped would become one of the premier yoga centers in New York the day before 9/11. I was married, had a 3-month-old baby and a new home. And starting a new business in the best of times is really uncertain and anxiety producing. In that moment, it was terrifying. And also, you know, so I was thinking about who did I lose? I was mourning deeply, as everybody in the city was. And at the same time, I was wondering if I was actually going to launch something, you know, at this moment in time, and experience really sort of visiting with the family of like this one person who passed that day. Really reminded me that we have one pass, you know, we have one shot at this thing called life. And maybe you believe in afterlife, maybe you believe in reincarnation. That's cool. But to the extent that I want to make the best use of my time while I'm here, it made me really think about how I want to spend my time, and that were not made any promises. You know, people didn't go to work that morning expecting not to come home, and yet 3,000 didn't. So how do we live each day where we can, on the one hand, honor a value around responsibility and financial security and integrity, but on the other hand, also do things that nourish us, do things that we feel like we're here to do. And that's been a consistent thread. You know, like that seed was really powerfully planted 20 years ago, and it has only continued to grow since then.
Wow. You're right. 20-year anniversary. It's incredible that you took such a devastating experience for the country and even yourself personally, and even lost a friend, and turned that into something that became a catalyst for the work that you do today. I find that incredibly remarkable. One of the things I think about a lot and tend to share, although I know it isn't received very popularly, is this idea that this concept of one shot, that we are going to die, this concept of death itself is such a powerful tool when viewed appropriately through a lens that can create presence, gratitude, and provides a sort of filter to make decisions for what is it that I'm going to do in my life that will nourish me on a day-to-day basis. Because this is it. Regardless of an individual person's beliefs, religious beliefs, spiritual beliefs, the afterlife, the fact from a human perspective is that most of us will be forgotten in a couple generations. And when you start to really meditate on these ideas, some find them very sobering and somber, and I understand that. There's no judgment there, and I do as well. I think it's easy to become nihilistic about such an idea, but it can also be incredibly, it can put you in a state of awe at the miracle of the opportunity itself to be here and for you and I to have this conversation. And look at what you've done with your life as a result of that. You have put out some of the most beautiful, incredible, meaningful work for the last 20 years. You've done it for much longer than that, I'm sure. But you continue to do that because I'm sure these are things that you meditate on as well. And I think that's why I find so much in common with your work and why it resonates with me so much, because when something has depth and soul to it, I think it stands out in the world. I think no amount of marketing will ever match authenticity, which is a word we love to throw around. But it's very clear in your work. So I appreciate you for that. I really do.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I'm just not interested in I'm not interested in not going deep, and that's not a judgment on anyone else. It just happens to be the way that I'm wired. I've never been happy with the fact that something does or doesn't work, or does or doesn't, like, have an effect. I'm somebody who always wants to go 10 layers into the cause. And then I want to use that because I want to break whatever exists and then figure out if I can make something better. That's the scientist and the maker impulse in me sort of like teaming up to figure out, like, how do we move things forward? Like, I mean, it's funny. I haven't even shared this with anyone because it's been so busy with other things, but over the last year, we redesigned my own personal website, and the top panel now, there's like a giant picture of my face, which is a whole different story for someone who's like doesn't love being forward facing. And then next to it are the words, "I make things that move people," and that's what I'm here to do. So if I make something and it just happens to be inconsequential, I want to make things that actually, like, that do something, that evoke something, that progress something in some meaningful way.
Mm-hmm. One of the aspects of this whole concept of everything you're talking about is just the idea that work can be fulfilling. And I sort of see two camps on this idea, where there's a whole host of people that are attempting to help people create productivity, efficiency, and decrease the amount of time that they spend working, because they believe the narrative is at the root that work can never be fulfilling. What I think that people like that are lacking is the personalized perspective on all of these concepts as a whole. Some people, from a personality perspective, will love work and the meaning that it can provide, and they want to view everything more holistically. So, for example, for me, like my Sparketype, like my number one is the Maven, and the Shadow is the Sage, and the anti-Sparketype is the Advocate. When I read about the Maven, I was blown away. I was deeply impressed, because I can see the level of nuance at play here that describes not just somebody who wants to share or is so like insatiable with the learning aspect, but wants to share but doesn't really care if people do anything with it. Because there's a huge difference between someone who wants to mentor people and work with people one-on-one and hold their hand and help them improve, versus someone like me, where it's the learning that's the priority for the sake of myself and the insatiable curiosity. And I like sharing it. And if you want to do something with it, and anyway, we could go into the nuances of that, but there's so much nuance there with the difference between how a person might view this idea of like what really fuels them, what really like sparks them up in life. And for me, I could do that for the rest of my life and be incredibly fulfilled. There's this, one of my favorite quotes, you may have heard, I'm curious if you have, it's by Alan Watts. And he poses a simple question where he says, what would you do if money were no object? And many of the questions that you ask in your assessment and the work that you do is like asking the same question. Because if we can align ourselves with the work that we would do if money were no object, which to so many people seems like a fairy tale, we would be endlessly fulfilled. And the way you pose your questions is very, very similar.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt. I think I'm always trying to get at the deeper impulse for effort. I think there's a lot of great work out there that looks at like, what is the job, what is the role, what is the title, what is the devotion that will give you the feeling that you want to have. I think that's valuable. And eventually, like, you have to land there, because that's the granular manifestation that you end up like interacting with. And that's what the world sees and potentially finds value in and compensates you for, if in fact that becomes your job and you want it to become your job. But when you focus just on that, the trap is that At some point that's going to end. It always does. Whether it's a matter of circumstance, whether it's a matter of your own shift in interest, in perspective, there will always come a time where that sort of superficial, granular expression of something deeper is no longer available to you, or you're no longer interested in doing it. And if you have attached the notion that for you to derive meaning and purpose and joy and find flow, you have to be doing that thing. When it ends, you're not just losing a job. In your mind, you're losing access to that state that you hold sacred, and you're losing your sense of identity. Whereas if you actually can understand what is the deeper impulse for effort that gives me that feeling, that may show up in 1,000 different ways at 1,000 different moments in my life, and that no matter what time limited expression it shows up as, if that comes to an end, I can, in the blink of an eye, see how this impulse can be let out in 100 different ways. And when that thing happens, when the job ends, when the devotion comes to its logical conclusion, when the role is eliminated, when the industry takes a huge hit, and everyone in your department is outsourced, sure, there's a moment of grief, there's a moment of head spinning and uncertainty, but fundamentally, you still know what to say yes or no to when you're looking to the future to give you that feeling that you want to have back. You know how to recreate it in a way where if it's attached to something surface level, you feel like you're just completely adrift and you have no idea what was actually giving you that feeling. You have no idea how to recreate it. And you could spend years trying to find it again and never really get it. So the work that I've always been curious about is, rather than starting at surface level and just trying on a whole bunch of different jobs, which I think is actually important, but it's not the starting point. Let's see if we can get to what's happening underneath the hood. Let's get to the deeper impulse. And then it informs all the different things that you might try on the surface and helps you get to them, the ones that truly light you up, much faster. And it gives you the freedom of understanding that you're not constrained to that one particular job, role, company, industry, or domain, that you can find this in so many different ways and places in your life, and many of which may not include being your primary job. This may be your primary role. You may be a parent or a caretaker or a volunteer, and that is an equally valid expression of that impulse.
I'm sure you hear this a lot in your community. What do you say to people that take your assessment, better understand their identity, who they are, what makes them come alive, and go, you know what, Jonathan, that's cool and all, but you don't understand my life. You don't know what it's like. I can't for X, Y, and Z reason. They feel trapped by their circumstances, or that they're forced to do play the role that they're currently playing. And they see the vision and the goalpost and the identity that they want to manifest and become and play out, but they're just so far from it. What do you say to people like that?
Well, first, I think it's important to be honest and open and real. I don't understand that person's life. I'm not them. I don't have their history. I don't have their circumstances. I have, an entirely different set of opportunities and constraints. I am a white, middle-aged, cisgen male living in the United States, right? Let's acknowledge the fact that there's a certain amount of privilege built around that, just as a societal construct. People don't start on the same opening line. And I think it's important to not step into sort of the popular psychology thing where, you pretend that everybody is the same and everyone has the same starting line. Everyone has the same opportunity and constraints, and acknowledge the reality that there's a lot of inequity in the world. And I may not understand that person's unique circumstance, and it may be profoundly different than mine. And they may have very real and hard constraints and circumstances in their lives. And rather than being Pollyannistic about it and saying you're just not working hard enough. Let's get honest about that and say, look, like if you're a single working parent and you're supporting a family, and maybe you're supporting extended family, and you're working 3 jobs, things are going to be different for you, and it may be harder for you to step into a place of agency. It may be harder for you to even consider the notion of saying yes to something that would make you come alive because you're just trying to pay the rent.
Right.
So let's first be honest about that. Let's not do this or like typical pop psychology dance of you need to just buck up, because that's just not real world. And what you're doing is layering shame on top of the experience of that person rather than understanding and grace and compassion, and possibility. So let's start there, right? Let's start by being honest about the way the world is. And then let's ask the question, okay, so even if you're that person, does that mean that you don't have access to these ideas? And I think that's a more real starting point. And for me, the answer is, let's look at the circumstances of your life and see if there are some places where you can gain just a little bit of it. That may not mean that now is the moment where you get to walk away from the thing that's actually taking care of you, sustaining your family. But can you look at it and say, it's not a part of my job description, but is there a way for me to, once I know what the deeper impulse is for me that gives me this feeling of coming alive, once I actually understand what that is, if I look at what I'm doing right now, is there a way to say yes to a little bit more of the things that might give me that feeling and no to a little bit more of the things that won't? Can I do these slight reimaginings of the things that I'm doing? If you're working in a restaurant and working 16-hour shifts, and you happen to find out that your impulse is a performer, can you actually find a way to, in small moments when you're interacting with a patron, energize and animate and bring that juice to the exchange, even for fleeting moments rather than rushing through it? Because even those tiny, tiny, tiny little shifts will start to make a difference in the way that you're experiencing anything. And then if you zoom the lens out, can you reframe the fundamental nature of what you're doing so that it injects purpose into the experience? So really interesting study looked at the janitorial staff in a hospital. They basically were asking them, how much of a sense of purpose do you feel in your job? How much do you love your job? Now, that's not a job that a lot of people would probably look at and say, this is, the thing that I'm born to do. It fills me up. And yet a certain percentage of people who are doing this work loved their work.
Yeah.
They felt this strong, strong sense of purpose. They could not wait to show up at this job every day. So they started to deconstruct and say, well, what's going on here? What is happening with these people that is allowing them to experience literally the identical job description, the identical work differently? And there were 2 things that they discovered. One is there was an internal reframe. So these people didn't feel like they were just, quote, cleaning up after everyone else. What they believed in their hearts was that they were a mission critical part of the care team. If there was a patient in a room and a family who was there taking care of them, they were a part of the team that helped that patient get well. They were part of the team that helped that family feel at peace, right? So that reframe added a layer of purpose that wasn't necessarily there if you looked at it differently. And that sense of purpose, that sense of I'm part of something bigger, made a profound difference in the way that they experience the work. And then there's an external shift that happens that's more about what I'm talking about, which is without even realizing it, that person would start to behave in all sorts of different ways. So their job description wasn't necessarily like if they were in a room or if they were cleaning to look at the patient and say, hey, how are you doing? Or tell them a joke or share a fun story but because they were there was something joyful about what they're doing. There was something purposeful about it. It changed the way that they actually stepped into the role, and they did it. They did little things differently that then created a dynamic where people responded to them differently, and it reinforced this broader sense of purpose. So that person that you talked about earlier, yes, let's acknowledge that circumstances affect people's opportunities differently. And at the same time, we have within us oftentimes more agency over our ability to experience a nearly identical circumstance differently through partly a reframe in our own psychology and partly tiny little changes in the actions that we take in the context of the work, often that have nothing to do with the job description. But in doing them, it allows us to experience the work in a much richer way. And that transforms the nature of it, and it gives us so much more. So that even that is sort of like a fairly superficial exploration, but that's the beginnings of how I'd have that conversation with somebody.
I think that's a beautiful, comprehensive answer. I really do. And while it is still perhaps in your mind a little superficial and we need to go into the nuts and bolts more for that person, I think it's a beautiful opening and a way to look at that. I believe something very similar, and to your point on this study with that internal reframe, it's incredible how much perspective and belief can change the entire life experience of an individual. And it's also interesting that some people naturally already seem to have this disposition, and some of us have to cultivate the ability to continuously learn how to change these lens we have, these eyes we have, these beliefs that we have, completely shift our experience. And many of us have to learn how to do that. We have to write our gratitude for the day. We have to focus on the things that we believe can be positive to those around us, rather than I'm stuck in this. In that example, I'm a service to others. It's incredible. And I think that I've been around those people. I think we've all seen and witnessed those people. You know, you're walking down a hallway and there's somebody whistling and working and saying hello. And you're just like, wow, you really seem to have hit the jackpot here. Did you win the lottery or something? No, I'm alive. I love what I do. Have a great day. You know, it's like, and I think that some people, if we go into the psychology of it, of course, there's just also natural genetics at play here, and there's the environment that they grew up in. So as you said, we cannot judge the circumstances of another, and your answer starting point is a compassionate one. We have to begin with a certain level of compassion, because we're not that person. If we were that person, we would behave the exact same way. We would have the exact same beliefs. And one of the things that frustrates me in our judgment of others is that we fail to understand that all we're really doing is projecting. It's so easy to sit back and tell somebody that you should buck up and you should do it differently. But if you'd been through the experiences, the traumas, the circumstances, or if you looked and felt the way that this person felt, of course you would behave the exact same way, because you would literally be them. And so the only thing that we control at the end of the day, and I think part of your work and my work and what so many people are doing in the world is, okay, let's acknowledge where we're all at, but let's sort of begin to build and learn and accumulate the tools to change our perspective, to give ourselves a chance to empower ourselves and place ourselves in positions where we can have more joy, where we can have more of those fleeting little moments, because they are very fleeting at times. But they're wonderful and they're worth chasing, because when you do the work that makes you feel alive, time stands still. It really is, like, you know, you said earlier, it's a feeling of flow, and we all deserve that, I think. And I think society seems to be moving more and more in that direction, where this is going to be possible and more accessible to everybody, I hope. How do you see work changing in the future? Do you believe that this will be easier to access for more people?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, especially given the moment that we're in. You know, as we're having this conversation, you just keep hearing on the news this phrase, the great resignation, all the time. You know, more people have quit jobs at all levels than ever before, sort of in measurable history, and more people are choosing not to step back into the workforce that have stepped out either involuntarily or voluntarily. Um, and they're sending a message to industry that, things are really broken. The interesting thing to me is that so much of the coverage of this phenomenon in the media is focused on, well, like, oh, this is a now problem. And I'm just like, no, this is a multi-generational problem. Like, people didn't instantly just start experiencing burnout. People didn't instantly have a lack of meaning in the work that they were doing. They didn't instantly feel like there was, like no boundaries between their work and life. This has been an evolutionary process that has been degrading the human work condition for years. All the data speaks to it. Like, you see engagement levels, everything that is measured in industry that like would point to human flourishing in the context of work, the numbers are not good, and they haven't been good for a really long time. And even when there have been these upticks in the numbers, they're like infinitesimal upticks, and people point to them as sort of like like great conquests. And in fact, no, it's what it's telling us is that things have gone from abysmal to just really bad. And that's not to say that everybody hates work. It's not to say that everybody has a horrendous work condition. Plenty of people are getting what they want, but many more people, if you look at the data, have not. So this is not a new moment. Like, this has been an 18-month Band-Aid tearing off of a wound that has been slowly building and festering for decades. So I think we're trying to figure out, like, how do we fix what happened in the last 18 months? And it's not about that. And it's like, how do we reimagine the future of work in a larger context? How do we figure out like what was really broken about it that is just being exacerbated now at a level where people have just been pushed over the edge and they're not willing to deal with it anymore? And a lot of the bigger issues are, a woeful misalignment of the work that people are doing with the fundamental things that actually nourish them and fill them up. There's certainly cultural challenges. There's an expectation of overwork and overwhelm. There is, what used to be known as work-life blend, which is a phrase that I happen to, or work-life balance. I really dislike that phrase because, as you really astutely noted earlier, that the assumption there is that work and life are in opposition, rather than like, wow, I could actually love the thing that I do. Then there was this idea of work-life blend. Well, like technology always on. I like what I do. It's sort of, I'm just blending. I'm weaving things in and out. And now we've moved into this place of what I call work-life bleed, where like they're literally bleeding into each other and we are bleeding out as part of that process. Cultures that denigrate and are not structured around dignity and compassion, cultures that are about, like productivity porn and efficiency rather than exalting the human being and investing in the growth of the individual and helping them figure out how do they flourish as individuals, whether that means that they eventually end up leaving the organization or not. And the reason that they would leave is because you're not doing the job that you need to do to make it a great place to be. So I see all these as not new signals, but I see these as like the perfect storm of all these signals coming together, being exacerbated at a level where people are finally saying, I am done. I'm just done. And while I think it's a brutal time, I think it's also an incredibly fertile time for organizations, industries, institutions, paradigms to listen, to finally listen, and to understand that the way forward is to invest not just in maximizing shareholder value in sort of like the old school public company mode of being, but in maximizing the humanity and the growth of the individuals that make your very existence possible. And knowing that when you do that, most of the other problems will start to get solved themselves. So I think we're in this really amazing moment where there's a lot of pain in the world of work, but there's so much more possibility. And I see organizations and teams and leaders who are saying yes to this, who are actually acknowledging this and saying, let's do some serious reimagining. And that may involve a fair amount of creative destruction along the way. But it is in the name of reassembling the pieces of a puzzle that has been shattered, whether you want to acknowledge or not, into a whole new paradigm that is going to be so well prepared to step into the next generation and the next season of work and life. And those who say yes to that, those who actually understand, like that this is what it's going to take, I feel like they're going to set themselves up to be the world leaders. Those who basically try desperately to hang on to and revert to the way that things were done, I don't see really good futures for those organizations. And look, I don't, oddly, it's odd to say, I don't really cast a lot of shame or
Sure.
blame on this. We all hate change as a rule. And when if you work in an organization, you've risen up and become a leader in an organization, you've devoted 30 years of your life to promises being made and things being the way that, they're supposed to be. And you've literally structured your entire life around that. And then all of a sudden that's being stripped away. That is a painful place to be, not wanting to actually just completely reimagine things at that moment. It's completely understandable. And yet I also don't think it's the way forward.
I couldn't agree more. I think you nailed it. And I think that a lot of companies, especially larger organizations, are beginning to figure this out. And I'm already seeing examples of that in my network of people that are doing work like this, that are helping organizations move forward. And I couldn't agree more with this focus on the individual. When you really give the individual what they need, when you put them in the seat that is designed for them to do the work that makes them come alive and to stop bleeding from both work and home, and it all just starts compounding. I mean, I'm watching this happen in multiple industries right now. My wife works in education. She's a head of school at a private school here in San Diego, does incredible work, but man, oh man, I mean, watching these different industries and what they're going through and this great by the way, I hadn't heard that phrase before. I'm actually a little bit out of sync with a lot of these types of news events, but that's such a good phrase, the great resignation, to describe what is going on, because it's almost like its own epidemic that a lot of people are concerned about, but I see as this beautifully positive thing as well. I think it takes people stepping back, pausing, reimagining their lives, reevaluating their value systems to be able to move forward in the best way possible. And I, as an optimist, especially as a techno optimist, I couldn't agree more that we're going to move forward into something that is going to really serve the individual. And as a byproduct of that, all those things, productivity, the number of sales calls a person makes in a day, output and shareholder value will increase in an ironic, counterintuitive way if we stop focusing on it as the primary measurement. Those things are a byproduct of an organization that has individuals that are aligned and clear on one North Star. And I think we're moving in that direction. I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah. I mean, you can make an analog with sort of like the happiness research on an individual level. So, there's a lot of people are like, let me do everything I possibly can to be as happy as I possibly can. Because that is the ultimate metric for a life well lived. And yet the research is pretty crystal clear that the more time spent in the direct pursuit of happiness, the less happy you are. We know that the way that you get happier is to do other things that have the byproduct of happiness. And I think it's a similar thing in industry, the byproduct of investing in all these individuals, the byproduct of investing in growing an individual, finding the sweet spot between effort and meaning and purpose and flow and full expression. The byproduct of all of that, is going to be creativity, innovation, retention, loyalty, flourishing, all these other things. Um, but it's going to take some really bold leaders
Yeah.
to run those experiments and then see, oh, this is actually working on a whole different level. And the truth is, a whole bunch of people are going to leave along the way because they're going to realize they're not a good fit for the organization or the team or the project. And man, what a great thing that will be, because then you'll have seats to bring people into who really are better fits. But it's just, it is going to take a paradigmatic shift in the way that we look at what an organization is here to do and who they're here to serve. And like you said, there are some organizations that are starting to do a really interesting and innovative job of doing that. And I'm looking at that. I've worked with some of them, and I'm, as hard as this moment is, I'm also super optimistic as well and really excited about where we're headed.
What about outside of these large organizations, like on an individual level? Do you see that shifting as well? This whole concept of the creator economy, the solopreneurs, it really also seems to be expanding, where a lot of people stepped out of their jobs in the traditional organizations, and they're seeing that they can go to places like Upwork and make a living and create a service or a product, and all of a sudden something that in the past 10 years ago, you're like, you've been in this game a long time like me, the things that we used to do online 10 years ago took God knows how long to put together. Just simple basic e-commerce websites to deliver a service you can do with clicks of a button now. Do you see that shifting as well?
Yes and no. Yeah, I do think the opportunity to do that is there for a lot of people. I mean, if you there, the technology and the platforms that would allow you to understand what is the thing that I need from work, not just that I want to give to work, but what do I need back from it, and then find the platforms and the opportunities and that are, effectively remove the gatekeepers from your ability to do that. They're there all over the place. And at the same time, there's a huge amount of entrepreneurial delusion that's infusing this space too. I've been an entrepreneur many times over. I've been a founder many times over at this point in my life, and I have counseled and worked with and advised many. And there's a sweet spot between being, incredibly possibility oriented, but also being tethered to what is truly possible as you start to step into a process of trying to accomplish something big. And well, I do believe there's a lot of opportunity for the creator economy. At the same time, just because you can, and just because the platforms are available to you, doesn't mean you should, and it doesn't mean you'll be good.
Right.
There's a level, if you want to go out on your own,
from this perspective,
it's like, if you want to go out on your own, like, you really need to understand what you're saying yes to and what you're saying no to. And you need to know that, like, all the whatever illusion of certainty and a paycheck and benefits and all this stuff that you had is all gone, that you are never actually working for yourself. You're always working for those that in some way would see what you're doing as having value and raise their hand to support you, which means that they are effectively your bosses, your managers, your leaders. And that, there's a level of craft and a level of mastery and a level of skill that needs to go into your ability to step into these spaces and flourish. That you still have to work really, really hard. I do not know a highly, quote, successful founder or a creator who does not work a lot. So the illusion of, wow, I just get to kind of like spend 30 minutes a day, create this thing, pop it over on this thing, and then I get to go surf or play or hang out with my friends or do what I want to do, and I'm going to have like all the other benefits that I want. I think there's going to be a lot of wake up calls along the way. And it's not to say to anybody, don't try it, but it's to say that if you do raise your hand to step into that space, do it with your eyes open, be hopeful, come at it from a place of optimism and possibility, and also know you need to work really, really hard,
Yeah.
and you need to devote yourself to a level of craft and mastery, and you will always be in service. If you want to make a living doing it, you will always be in service of those who want what you have at the value that you're providing it. And that means that you have to be accomplished at a level where you're providing a really high level of value. And that takes time, so um, excited about the possibility, and also do believe that there's going to be a certain amount of delusion that leads people running into the space, and in relatively short order have them running back out of the space.
Couldn't agree more. It is incredibly taxing, difficult, and it's like a walled garden. Once you kind of look and stare and get inside, you'll kind of find that it's not all roses and sunshine and rainbows. I mean, I think it was Elon Musk that said starting a startup is something akin to staring into the abyss and chewing glass. It's not for everybody. And I think that this delusion is perpetuated by social media in particular. And I know we both know many people that are actually people that we admire as human beings that are responsible for sort of perpetuating the ideas into the world that this can be very easy, that this can be of limited time and resource, and that your life will be better as a result of it. Whereas I think you and I both believe that this is a personality question. This is a disposition question. It is not something for everybody. But my favorite part of everything you just said, Jonathan, by the way, is if you think that you're going to go and become a founder or entrepreneur because you want to remove yourself from having a boss or having people telling you what to do, that is one of the biggest delusions. People will find out the hard way that there is no really escaping that. And even for those that say, well, I don't have any customers or clients, I just do crypto all day long. It's like, oh yeah, well, your customer then is the market. You better be ready to deal with that and the unpredictability and volatility of everything that you can't control.
And even in crypto, right? If you look at Web3 right now, who's really succeeding there? It's the people that are actually not just, if you look at the NFT world, which is sort of like where I'm most well versed in sort of like Web3 business. It's not the people that are just offering something on a platform. It's the people that are deeply investing in community and building a community that then becomes consumers, co-creators, supporters, and evangelists of the work. And that takes real effort. Like you've got to be in there a lot on a regular basis to make that actually succeed.
Massively. Now I'm really curious. Where in NFTs are you spending time specifically?
I'm really fascinated by NFTs as a source of really just sort of like on the art side, on the music side, on the animation side. Like what Micah Johnson is doing with Aku is really fascinating case study. And he works nonstop. He's literally building a world around a character that he created for his then 4-year-old nephew, who asked him if Black people or Black boys can be astronauts. And he sketches this character out of charcoal and then literally takes this and turns it into a character, builds a world around it, builds NFTs around it, uses this as a funding mechanism to create a media enterprise, which then gets optioned as a major motion picture film, which is in development right now. And he literally works 7 days a week from the early morning until late at night. And he is in his Discord community on a regular basis because they're the ones who make it all possible. Yeah. He is beholden entirely to them.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and we've seen this. I'm sure you've seen this multiple times as well. If one of these projects is just purely hype and the community is sort of an illusion and is only there because they're there for some sort of short-term game, those are the projects and the people that really lose. And the founders, the creators that already have a following or develop a following of people and nurture that community through all the volatility, they stay strong. And we're seeing that with a few communities right now, because there was, at the time of our recording, we're recording November 11th, a few weeks ago, there was this huge dip in the market, but a handful of projects stayed stable. So I find it incredibly, incredibly fascinating as well. Jonathan, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your assessment which I find really, really awesome, as I said, and really nailed me as the maven. Why did you feel that you needed an assessment? What was the thought behind that?
Yeah, there's a lot of great work out there to help people figure out elements of their personality, their relational styles, their strengths. We've all seen Myers-Briggs Strengths Finder, VIA Strengths, DISC, individual organizations. There are so many variations of sort of like the classic 4-quadrant assessment. You've got much more broadly like the big 5 personality traits. And they all offer pieces of the puzzle. They all help us figure out like what are the pieces of our identity that matter, that we want to invest in, build around, and understand, and that guide our decisions and our behavior in the world. But what I wasn't seeing was something that was much more narrow, that spoke really to what is the deeper impulse for effort or for work that gives us this feeling of coming alive. And that to me is such a huge unlock key, both because it allows you to be seen in a level that is incredibly clarifying and empowering, and also because it then guides your decisions and your actions. It gives you a basis for which to understand why you're saying yes and no to different things, and also to understand what to look for and to not look for. And I just wasn't seeing that level of specificity and depth in the marketplace, which is full of all sorts of great other assessments and tools. They just weren't speaking to that specific thing. And for me, I was really curious about it myself. But also I've worked with so many different people over the years who've had that question. And we sort of like navigated it through cobbling together all sorts of different process that range from academic literature to spiritual processes to there's all sorts of stuff that is out there that is either, there was nothing that I found that was straightforward, that was vetted, that was validated, and that provided really clear, simple insight that landed intuitively as true, and that was immediately actionable from that point forward. And that's why I started really like into this work, because it's pretty hard to build something that works. We've since, like having this conversation, over 600,000 people have completed this assessment now. So we're sitting on over 30 million data points, and we're looking at like what are the phase 3 and 4 surveys and studies that we'll be doing to identify deeper correlations between different states of affect and all sorts of different things. So it takes a lot of effort to create a body of work like this. And I do it, I didn't do it because I anticipated the moment that we're all in and everybody's saying, wow, this is exactly the thing that like is needed at this exact moment in time, because I had no idea what was coming our way. Yeah. But I did it in part because, like I said earlier, this is not new. Like this is all like these questions have been with us for a really long time. And I just wasn't finding the focused tools that I thought would be really effective at helping people get closer to a useful, valid answer without a lot of struggle. And that was a lot of what really pushed me to keep deepening into this work.
Yeah, and I also see how your Sparketype and who you are plays into the fact that you created this in the first place. I'm curious, did you work on a lot of the back end concepts to create this assessment? Did you put that all together, or did you sort of have help team outside? How did you come up with the concepts and the back end side of things, the framework for the assessment itself?
Yeah, it was pretty much me. I'm very fortunate in that I have access to also incredibly smart mentors and friends who play the role of sort of unofficial advisors and sometimes official advisors who are deep into the world of positive psychology, social sciences, and things like that. So I was able to bounce a lot of ideas, especially, it took about a year to develop the assessment, and we kept iterating through different beta versions of it. On the one hand, we needed to actually figure out how to build an algorithm and the technology that was different than your typical one that increased the validation, the accuracy of this. But on the other hand, I had to do the work of like on a fundamental level. When I say like, how do you find and do work that makes you come alive? What do I even mean when I use the phrase come alive or be sparked? It's a very nebulous phrase. So like, okay, so how do I deconstruct that? So for me, it took time for me just saying, okay, what am I actually feeling when I'm doing that work? Well, I feel like there's a sense of meaning, like what I'm doing actually matters. I feel like I'm able to access flow more readily. I feel excited and energized, even if it's really hard work and long hours. I feel a sense of expressed potential, like there's nothing that's being held back. And I feel like a sense of purpose, like I'm working towards something that matters to me. And more broadly, I have a feeling like I'm doing the thing that I'm here to do. So then I deconstruct those 5 components. And to me, now, because I want specificity. So when I say coming alive, I'm talking about a Venn diagram with the overlap of those 5 components. And then how do we build prompts and questions and technology around those 5 states to try and tease out, like, what are the ways that you can exert yourself that would elicit those 5 states? So a lot of this is really, this is me doing a deep dive over 2 decades and taking just a massive amount of notes, talking to a lot of incredibly smart people, and then going into my cave and just iterating and iterating and iterating, trying to break through silos, and then sharing it, like sharing the work with people who I trust, and then sharing it with, like a small number of beta testers and getting feedback, and then more beta testers, and watching everything break and then rebuilding it until we get to a level, But so it's been me at the center of this, but for sure guided over a period of like a lot of years by a lot of smart and incredibly kind and generous people.
Really something to be proud of, honestly. And yeah, congrats on building such a great tool. And I know from experience how hard and just incredibly arduous it is to put something like this together. I want to work toward wrapping up, and I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on this idea that I think about a lot. So I'm making an assumption here, but please feel free to not agree with it. But I want your thoughts on it. I believe when it comes to the good life, a lot of that has to do with our mindset in the present moment and our perspective, as we've kind of touched on throughout the conversation, and the places that we spend our time and our values. A lot of people defer happiness or the good life, whatever we want to call it, into the future. And they have this belief that if they achieve certain goals on their vision list, on their goal list, on their vision board, or accumulate certain items or check off certain accomplishments, that at that time they will be happy and they will be living that good life. So first of all, I guess, do you agree that a lot of people have this illusion that they live in, that they'll one day flip a switch and be happy when they achieve these things? And if so, why do so many people do that and not just make the decision to start today?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And research supports that pretty strongly too. Why we think that? I think it's just, it's sort of the culture that we tend to grow up in, which says that this is the order of things. First you work really, 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 really hard, and then you buy the opportunity to choose, like how to step into life to do things that make you happy. I think in no small part, it's probably left over from the Great Generation to a certain extent, where the notion of like living a happy life and being happy and working towards happiness is a fairly modern construct.
Yeah, very.
And for a lot, it was about family and meaning. It was about character. So the aspiration for happiness is like kind of like a fairly modern overlay in terms of like our aspiration and expectation. Not that it's a bad one, but I think like happiness is a great thing. And also research shows that it's also completely upside down. Like Sean Aker has done really great work around this, which basically says, like happiness first, then that actually is the thing that makes you much more, quote, successful or accomplished. Yeah. Like you don't accomplish a ton of stuff and then, quote, become successful and that makes you happy. It's actually the other way around. Like you work on the things like meaning and joy and connection, relationships and love that have the side benefit of being happier or more positive or having a better affect. And that then changes the way that you step into the process of work and devotion and effort and energy, and changes the outcomes that get created in your life, which creates this, what Barbara Fredrickson terms the upward spiral. And so we've kind of got it backwards.
We have this belief that we need time freedom through wealth and riches, and that there's a hierarchy of needs before we can ever focus on things like joy and fulfillment. And I also think that we have it backwards. I really do. I think that it's similar to the counterintuitive ideas that we discussed around work, actually. It's very similar, because I think that if we can step into nurturing ourselves, taking care of ourselves, putting ourselves in positions where we can grab little bits, little sparks of joy, all of a sudden we find that we didn't need to accomplish anything or have a certain amount of money or crypto in our nest egg to begin to even think about those concepts. And I actually think that for people that have this belief that they need to accomplish certain things before they work on being happy, what ends up happening is that you've spent decades and your MO is now work, 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 but not through the perspective of work is joyful and meaningful, but that it's a slog and it's a grind. And to actually flip out of that state of being, I don't think is easy at all. I don't think that there's a point where all of a sudden, yep, I hit my number, I'm done, because that goalpost always keeps moving, first of all. And secondly, you've been living in this repetitive, habitual state that you now have changed fundamentally as a person. So to think that you can go from being a high-flying CEO to all of a sudden working in your garden, I think that's a bit of an illusion. And I've seen it play out as well, just even anecdotally.
Yeah, completely agree. I think we're taught to define enough as just a little bit more.
Yeah. I wish I had the quote in front of me, but I recently read a book called The Psychology of Money. And I'll paraphrase it because I don't have it in front of me. But, there's this story, it might be in like one of the first two chapters, where I believe it's Kurt Vonnegut. People are at his house. I could be completely butchering this, but the gist of it is that they're at a famous author's house, and this other person with incredible wealth shows up. And, he's just finished creating this incredible accomplishment. They're in this mansion, and they say something along the lines of, he has 10 times more money than you do. Isn't that ironic? And so on and so forth. And he says, but I have something he doesn't have. And they're like, well, what do you mean? And he's like, well, I have enough. And that has been stuck with me ever since I read that, because that's exactly what you're saying. It's the opposite of what we're taught. Enough is this constant little game of accumulation of more. And if we play that game, we're sort of perpetually stuck in a cycle that I don't want to be in. And it sounds like you don't either, Jonathan. Well, listen, man, this has been an absolutely beautiful, wonderful conversation. I really appreciate you. Any final words that you'd like to close out with, and any asks for the audience, everyone watching, everyone listening, anything at all? How can we support? Obviously, the book.
First thing, and I just wanted to thank you for inviting me to this conversation. Really enjoyed it. I hope your audience has found some value in it. I've learned from listening to you and what you've shared, and I appreciate that. If I would leave you with a sort of like a parting invitation or prompt, or leave our listeners, it would really be, don't wait to do the work to come alive. We are made no promises in this life, and to wait until you tick some, fabled box, which gives you permission to step into a process of exploration, means that that box may never get ticked. So why not just take it now and take the first step into it?
Beautiful. Thank you. Perfect ending. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for spending this time with me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, pleasure.